And these people are needed.
Good evening.
Right here.
I'd like to call the March 7th, 2016 Davie County Commissioners meeting to order. This time, if you would join me in the invocation. Dear God, as we come before you this evening, as always, we're grateful for the opportunity to govern. We're grateful for the opportunity to live in these United States and in Davie County. We would ask your wisdom on this meeting as we make the best decisions we can for all involved in the county. In your name, amen. Okay, if you would stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, just as a housekeeping matter, Commissioner Jones is in transit. He's stuck in traffic, we believe, but hopefully he will be joining us momentarily. Okay, the next item on the agenda is to adopt the agenda. Mr. Vogler, I understand we have one item we need to add.
Yes, and it's on your table in front of you, a subordination of a lien. We'll need to add that to new business. Something that came across my desk today.
Okay, and Mr. Barrett, you had a change.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move to amend the agenda to add the subordination of lien and to take the utilities proposed line extension policy off the consent agenda and on to regular business.
Old business.
Old business, yes.
Okay.
It's under old business.
I'll second that motion.
Okay. All right, we have a couple changes to the agenda as presented. Have a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your hand. Okay, thank you. And now we need a motion to approve the agenda as amended.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, raise your hand. Okay, thank you. All right, next is public comment. Mr. Vogler. Next up is consent agenda. Anybody have any questions on the issues there? All right, if not, entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Motion to approve. Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Okay, all in favor, raise your hand. 4-0. Thank you. All right, next we go to the county manager's report. Mr. Ruffin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gentleman on the April 4th agenda, staff is going to put forward some organizational values that all of our department directors have worked very hard on. Obviously, they felt your support. They carry absolutely no weight. We believe they reflect and are meant to reflect, and we will certainly be training our employees that these are the values we think we need to reflect each and every day as we conduct the county's business. Now, I'm going to place those on the April 4th agenda. We'll send them out to you. I'm going to put them on the website and a number of other places that we can get some public comment. Probably will be in the county manager's newsletter that we'll send out later this month. So if you have questions, let me know. We'll have them on April 4th. Hopefully that you would adopt them so that we can begin to implement them in the organization through our training and orientation programs. Secondly and finally, this afternoon I made an offer for a recreation director. It has not been accepted yet. He is going to discuss that with his family over the next couple of days. I hope I'll be able to make an announcement on Monday, but did want to let you know we appear to be proceeding a little behind schedule. We'd hope to have someone here during March. I think we will have someone here April 1st. So that will help us over the next 90 days as we begin to prepare for the transition to the county's recreation program. Mr. Chairman, that completes my report.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ruffin. All right, moving to old business, two items. The first is the interlocal agreement with the Board of Education. Do you want to present
I'll be
this?
happy to. This is an agreement that's been cobbled together through a committee process that involved the chairman and vice chairman, the chairman and vice chairman of the Board of Education, and the manager and superintendent. Last month, during brief discussion of this, and subsequently, Mr. Jones is not here. He's certainly seen this information. I have not received a text from him asking to let me know if he wasn't going to be able to make it, but he'd probably following the law and not texting while he's driving. And I appreciate that. He asked if we would be willing to look at another strategy for setting the annual appropriation. As you know, we looked at one based on percentage, 41.3% of tax collections. He asked us to take a look at percentage based on student population, and Dr. Hartness and his staff was kind enough to put that analysis together along with the other, and he's here tonight, Dr. Hartness is, to present those findings, which we've seen and wanted the board to see, and then happy to answer any questions you may have after that. Dr. Hartness?
Thank you, Mr. Ruffin. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, thank you for the opportunity to come before you this evening and talk about this interlocal agreement. As Mr. Ruffin explained, this is something that's been in the works for some time, and we have talked and have discussed this at what might be the best approach for future funding for public education in Davie County. And we've put together a series of slides, and they're in your packet. There's one additional slide that I've added to this based on a question I got this week. That we'll go through and just look at an analysis of several different methods to determine an interlocal agreement, and then I'll entertain any questions that you might have as well. So we'll look at three different methods to determine the funding. The first is the one that Mr. Jones had recommended we look at is the local current expense appropriation based on a fixed per pupil expenditure. We'll look at another topic that was mentioned using the Consumer Price Index. And then we'll look at the draft formula that was in your packet as well, and how we came about that and how it might affect public education funding. So this first chart will show you using a fixed per pupil expenditure for the local current expense appropriation. For example, this past year we had 6,345 students, so you'll see that in this column or this row here. If we were to base last year's funding, which was $10.282445, that would be $1,621 per student. If we base that same per pupil expenditure on the local appropriation that is in the new formula, which is 41.3%, that allocation would go to $10.5 million, and that would be $1,661 per student. You can see the next two rows down, if we were to decline an enrollment by 100 students, or the third row down if we were to increase an enrollment by 100 students. It's pretty simple. You can just multiply 100 times that per pupil expenditure, and that would be about $162,000 or $166,000, and it would fluctuate up or down. So that would be a fixed per pupil expenditure, and let's look at what the statewide data says and then the pros and cons to that. When you look back 10 years, and we were asked to look back over a 10-year period of time for this analysis, in 05-06, we ranked 55th in local per pupil expenditure. And when you combine all of our funds of local, state, and federal, we were 104th out of 115 districts in the state. And I've talked to you even before in our budget meetings, and you understand why that is. And it's based on the wealth of Davie County, and we get very little federal funding compared to other school districts. If you look at our rank in 2014-15, it increased to 48th in local per pupil expenditure and 84th out of 115 school districts when you combine all three sources of funding. This past year, you increased the local current expense appropriation to Davie County schools, so when the statistics come out, I would say that we would continue to move up in rank, and for that we are appreciative, and I think we're headed in the right direction. So what are the pros and cons to using that approach? The pros, the school district and the county would know exactly what to expect based on the previous year's enrollment. If you said it's based on last year's enrollment, it's going to be a fixed per pupil expenditure. We can all do the math. We go into the budget cycle and we know what that funding might look like. What are the cons? It does not adjust for inflation. All of you who own businesses have known and have seen what the cost of doing business is over time. There is inflation involved in employing people especially, and that's where we've seen the biggest increase in cost for public education, is the cost of employing people, not only their salaries, but their benefits especially, the cost of health care, retirement contribution, those things. The cost of schools in an individual school really doesn't fluctuate a lot when you have small changes in enrollment. An example I might give is there's 12 campuses in Davie County. If we lost 100 students, let's just say that's 10 students per campus. The cost of operating that building, the utilities, the custodial services, the operational side that we pay for with current expense doesn't fluctuate greatly when you take that into account. It's going to fluctuate annually. Spikes in enrollment up or down has an effect on the county or on the school system in a negative way, either way you look at it. And all three of these methods that I'm going to explain are not based on need. That's a con for all three methods. It's not based on specifically what our needs have been identified to be. Each year, for the past several years, since I've been here, if you read my budget message that comes along with our budget request, I outline if revenues were available, these are all the areas that we would like to put back in place within our school system. Everything from teacher assistants to school nurses, counselors, those things that have been eroded away over time as funding from the state has declined. So again, it's not based specifically on need, but it is based on a formula. Let's look at the second method, the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a measure of average change over time in prices that people pay for consumer goods. It measures the change in prices, not the level of prices. We all know that the economies in different parts of America are different. The cost of living in different parts of America are different. So the CPI doesn't measure that necessarily, but it measures the change in price over time, the percentage change. It's a very widely used measure of inflation, and it's a good indicator of economic policies. The Consumer Price Index has multiple categories. There's an overall Consumer Price Index that includes everything, and then if you look into the data, there are these categorical exchanges. So everything from food to transportation to recreation. There's a section in there for education and communication. So you can look at what's the change in the cost of delivering education or communication over time. And if you dig into the data, this is what you see. This is a chart directly from the CPI. And in the middle there, in the yellow bar, you will see education singled out. You could come on down and say, we just want to look at the cost of educational books and supplies, or tuition, or elementary and high school tuition fees, or child care. But we just took the overall education CPI. And this is from 2007 to 2015. If you take the average change over that time period, it's about 4.3% per year. If you looked at just books and supplies, it's almost 6.8% per year. That's more than some of the other categories, but that is specific to the cost of delivering education in America. So let's look at what would it look like if we applied the CPI for education to local current expense funding. So I went back over that period of time that we had data, and that we started in 2007, 2008. And at that point in time, if you follow the orange line across the bottom, is the actual local appropriation of current expense from the County of Davie to the public schools of Davie County. In 07-08, it was about $8.3 million. 08-09, it was about $8.7 million. And if you look at the green or the light blue line, is the trajectory if you would have applied the Consumer Price Index for education to that funding. And you'll see for 2 years we were tracking right even with the CPI. And then if you look in this section here from 2009-10 to 2014, education spending in Davie County from the local current expense was flat. It declined actually in 2013-14. Now we did go through a recession during that middle of that time. And you will see that this past year there was an increase in local current expense appropriation to $10.282 million. If you would have kept the CPI as your percentage change over time and base the local appropriation on that, the current expense appropriation this past year would have been $11.784 million. So there's about $1.5 million gap between actual funding and what it would be if it were based on CPI. So what are the pros and cons of using that to determine funding? The increase would be based on a widely used measure of inflation that we could all put our hands on. We could keep up with change in the cost of doing business like utilities and salaries and benefits. We could afford to put back some valuable services that we could afford to increase the local teaching supplement for our teachers. It could be applied either to that per pupil expenditure or the previous year's allocation. It's a very predictable measure for budgeting. But the cons would be the CPI has a higher rate of increase than county revenues are tracking. So I think it would be difficult for the county to sustain that type of increase each year in local current expense appropriation if you based it on the CPI. And again, as I'll tell you in all three of these scenarios, it's not necessarily based on need. It's based on a formula. So let's now look at the draft formula that you have looked at. It was developed by the chairs, the superintendent and the county manager. It is based on a fixed percentage of total tax collected in the county. So that is a number that we would use from the previous year's audit. You would take a look at the previous year's audit that was published June 30th, the previous year. You would look at the property tax collected during that audit, and that's a tangible number we can all agree on because it's part of the audit. Where we started last year, you know that we made a request to the county, and that request was not fully funded, even though you funded most of it, and we are very appreciative of that. So we started at where the request was last year. We based the formula on that. And the formula essentially is 41.3% of the total property tax collected after you back out the fire tax that goes to our fire districts and the tax collected for debt service for the new high school. So you would back those things out before you calculated the 41.3%. It wouldn't be based on taxes that were collected for those other two purposes. So what are the pros and cons? It is a predictable measure for both boards. It adjusts as the county tax base adjusts. If we have new students that move into the school district, you would make the assumption the tax base would also increase and would be adjusted upward as families move in. And the inverse would also be true. It's based on actual tax collected from the previous audit. There are no projections. It's not based on projected revenues. It's not based on a budgeted number. It's based on actual tax collected. If we had significant needs arise, let's say that something really went crazy at the state level or the federal level and we saw a tremendous change in funding, we could still come back and request those based on what our needs are. It would not obligate you to fund those, just like you're not obligated to do those now. It's a 2-year agreement. We could modify it or amend it by mutual consent. When you look at the cons, again, it's not based on needs. The needs are much greater than what this formula would fund. And it does not address unfunded or underfunded federal or state mandates or the reduction in support at the state or federal level. And the other con is it is a 2-year agreement. So I can look at that both ways. So this is the slide that's not in your packet, and I added this over the weekend because I had a question come up as I presented this to the Board of Education on Tuesday evening. What would the current formula that you're proposing, what would it look like if it were applied to county funding? So I went back and used the same format of the previous chart, and this is the draft formula analysis. The green line is what county local appropriation would be if we applied the formula. The orange line is our actual appropriation. So you can see over time that the formula would be higher than the current appropriation, and if we applied the formula right now, there's about a $257,000 gap. You will see an uptick in 2014-15, and Mr. Manager, to my recollection, if it were based on the previous year, isn't that the year that the tax collection changed on property? On personal property. I think that's why that there was an uptick that 1 year. So if you look at the 3 different methods of determining the appropriation on a formula, if you had a fixed per pupil expenditure of $16.21, the funding for this next school year would be flat. It would stay the same. There's no adjustment for inflation. It would adjust up or down based on student enrollment. And if you use the CPI for education of 3.7%, there would be a $380,000 increase in 2015-16. If you stuck with the draft interlocal agreement, then the allocation would be about $10.5 million. As I shared this with the Board of Education on Tuesday evening, and I did not have any board members that were opposed to this formula. The Board of Education has not acted on the formula in a formal way. My plans are to bring that back to them next month and request that they approve the interlocal draft agreement as it has been presented, unless there are things that we recommend mutually that we should change. So I'll entertain any questions or discussion.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Hartness?
I have a couple questions, and thank you for that presentation. It's
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
very clear. And I think I get this, but let me make sure I understand. You showed for 1 year we were 55th in the state out of 100 counties, and that's the local county contributions.
It's the
So
local
we were
current
55th.
expense.
And then other factors, state and local funding and formulas, state and federal, let us be way down the chart.
Correct.
Somewhere in the hundreds out of 114 or whatever. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. 104 that first year.
And now we're at roughly 40, not now, actually, we're going to be better than this.
We are going to be better than that because last year's not been published yet.
So we were 48 before this year's comes in, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so we're heading in the right direction.
We are.
Okay. And do you have any idea of estimate of where it will be after those numbers come in?
I have no idea because that would be dependent upon what other counties had done as well.
And then the 1,628 per pupil expenditure, how is that arrived at?
That's just dividing the local appropriation by the student enrollment this past year of 6,345 students.
Thank you. And then the final question, I think I know the answer to this, but this is for 2 years, but will be 3 budget cycles, correct?
I haven't thought through that. I'll just have to go look at the dates, but I think that is correct.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett.
Okay, any other questions for Dr. Hartness? I would, Commissioner Jones had, as Mike already spoke to, had requested that we look at the per pupil, and he's not here, and I don't wish to speak for him. But correct me if I misunderstood, but you're going to present this draft, such as it is, to your Board of Education at the April meeting?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And we meet before, our meeting would be before yours. Last month was one of those unique months, for this month actually, where y'all actually met before us, so. What I would suggest is, Mike, if you could get with Mark, Commissioner Jones, and let him be up to date on this and get any questions back to you that he might have, and we take this up without fail at the April meeting, is what I would suggest. So, sound like a plan?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Right, the next item to our amended agenda is the discussion of the water and sewer line extension policy. And Mr. Barrett, you had a couple of changes that you had discussed and would like to present.
Yes, and it's actually just one change, I think. It's all on the 4th page of the proposed policy under R. And Ed had done a good job of crafting this the way I think we asked him to, but the suggestion was to make this more of a catch-all for county infrastructure and refer specifically to county infrastructure in terms of an impact assessment, so that in case there are other infrastructure issues that come into play, we can consider those, and then to add law enforcement and/or EMS services as an example of the types of infrastructure we're talking about. So that's the only change I propose.
Okay.
And the documents you've got on your table already have those changes in it.
So that now reads A, schools, B, transportation, C, law enforcement and/or EMS service, D, existing water and sewer lines, and E, remaining capacity of water and sewer systems.
That's correct.
Correct.
All right, anybody have any questions or comments about the proposed policy as presented this evening? We've been dealing with this for a few months now, so I think now is the time to take action, so I will entertain a motion to approve the policy as presented.
So moved.
A motion, do I have a second?
Second.
Second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all opposed, all in favor, raise your hand. 4-0. All right, thank you. Hope nobody's opposed. All right. Thank you.
I wanted to vote for that.
Oh. Well, all right. Okay, the next item is new business, and we only have one item on the agenda for new business, and that's the subordination deed issue that Mr. Vogler brought up, and I will turn it over to him.
And this is something that came across my desk this morning. We've got a local attorney who represents a third-party buyer of a tract of land, and in order for them to get a loan through the bank, they've got to have an easement into the property. The property owners have in fact already granted an easement to them back in December, or set up an easement. And you've got in your packet that I have handed to you tonight, both a map showing where the easement goes through, a copy of the deed of easement that's already been granted and actually has already been recorded now in the Register of Deeds office, and also the subordination of lien. When the attorney started doing their title search, when it first came across the desk, they told me that they realized there needed to be an easement into the property. Then they didn't realize, though, that the county also had a old deed of trust for $7,500 on the property, across part of the property from an old CDBG scattered housing grant, where we had funded some repairs under the scattered housing grant statute. And when they started doing the research and getting ready to close the loan, they realized that the county also had an interest in this property, and the only thing they're asking us to do is subordinate our deed of trust to that easement itself. I have read over the subordination of lien, looked at the descriptions, looked at the survey, and also at the easement from Mr. Wilson, Mr. Greer, over to Mr. McClamrock, and believe that it's in order. It's left up to the board, obviously, to make a determination on that, but we would need board approval in order for Mr. Ruffin to sign off on the subordination of lien, simply because there's real estate involved.
All right. Any questions for Mr. Vogler? Okay. Seeing none, entertain a motion to approve this lien subordination as recommended.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor, raise your hand. 4-0. Thank you. All right. Do we have any other new business to come before us this evening?
Yes, sir, Mr. Commissioner, if I may.
What is the issue, sir?
It'll be with regards to the eastern Davie sewer system information that's come to our attention in Creek as well as Premier Road West as to the plan to move a pumping station and creating a new existence of a gravity fed system that will be fed anaerobically septic sewage that will repeat history 20 years ago that we put up with and ended up spending a lot of money to make the septic sewage we pumped over Forsyth County. And it's being undone. We have an agreement with the county that keeps sewage being pumped. from Oak Valley up to what was Pippi Creek at the time made our lives miserable, day in and day out. And we're now seeing the gravity-fed system proposed doesn't have chemistry in place for Oak Valley, and also will open anaerobically septic sewage and businesses. 158 residences in that area on the system will be fed down Smith Creek, aerated out where everybody will relive what myself and several residents put up with for 3 years until it got removed.
And Mr. Chairman, that would be properly before the public comment period. That's where that should have been.
Are you Mr. Lane?
Yes.
I take it, okay. What I would ask Mr. Lane is if you would get with Mr. Ruffin, the email that you sent to me today, I've shared with our board, and I think I talked to Mr. Ruffin about this, and I think he is prepared to have, I know you met with one engineer, but I think, I'm no engineer, we're not engineers, but I think our engineer has spoke to some of your issues, but we would certainly allow you to meet with the other engineers and get your issues resolved, or questions answered.
Okay, the engineering of solutions that are possible to avert the issue were presented to the engineers, as well as the mayor and Mr. Ron in the discussion we had last Wednesday. What came above that was a proposal different than what I suggested. There's 2 or 3 different proposals that are different, that resolve everybody's needs and issues at a lesser expense, to the degree at which the need to move that cost is an assumption that they can't gravity feed 70–80% of the real estate that's proposed to be the marine run. That's incorrect. The engineer indicated yes, a lot of it can be fed through gravity-fed systems to the pumps where they're at now.
Yes, sir. And
So I would like to make sure the proposal that I did give doesn't get modified to different proposals that end up running the bill a couple $1 million. So working with the county engineers in Raleigh is the best proposal.
well, I would ask that Mr. Ruffin get with you and get your proposal such as it's presented, entered into the record, and we can vet that. My understanding it's been looked at, but we want to make sure that everyone's been heard on the issue. So I will ask Mr. Ruffin, or I am asking Mr. Ruffin to give you a call and get your issues resolved or addressed.
All right, appreciate it. I just don't want to see history repeated and spending more proceeds than are necessary to provide a solution.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we will move to commissioners' comments. Mr. Ferguson.
So I would just like to thank everyone for coming out tonight, and obviously, we do hear what you have to say. That's what government's all about, and we appreciate it. And anytime you want to come and speak to us, you sign up, and we are glad to listen. And thank you again for coming out. And as always, I'd like to thank all of our dedicated county employees for all they do and what they've been through in this winter period that we've been through. It's been a pretty tough time on a lot of them. Budget season's coming up, and our financial people are going to be very busy for that, I know. And again, thank you all for coming.
Mr. Barrett.
Just want to say thank you for coming. Sort of echoing what Commissioner Ferguson said, you know, we make decisions, we have to make decisions, but at times too, we also need to be sure we incorporate new thoughts, new information as it comes along. So whether it's sales tax, whether it's sewer, whether it's schools, all the issues that we face, we need to continue to receive public input, appreciate public input from all of you who come and participate. So thank you so much.
Poindexter.
I'd just like to echo, thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. It's good to see a healthy crowd out here, and we hope to see this again next month. Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out. Appreciate all the comments I've received about the sales tax issue. Appreciate the speakers on that issue this evening. And again, hope to continue to gather input on that as we move forward. Next Tuesday is the election. Your right to vote has been a hard-fought right in this country, so I hope everyone exercises that. From my individual perspective, I agree with Mr. Liggins on the NC bond. It's about $5.9 million goes to the Davidson Community College system between us and Davidson County, and I'm not sure how they would deploy that if they got it, but I think it is a valid point or valid need. And with that, hope you come out next month, and we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Second. We are adjourned. Thank you.